The stadium lights cut through the October night like daggers, illuminating the faded white lines of Jefferson High's football field. 21 years had passed since Derrick Thomas last stepped onto this turf as a player. But tonight, with 3 minutes left on the clock and his team down by 4, he was lacing up cleats again. The crowd of 2,000 small-town faithful had fallen silent, watching in disbelief as their 38-year-old volunteer coach stripped off his windbreaker to reveal shoulder pads underneath. His hands trembled not from nerves, but from the weight of 2 decades of what-ifs and the roar of memories, flooding back like a broken dam. The scoreboard read, Visitors 21. Jefferson Eagles 17. State Championship Semifinal. Everything his boys had worked for hung in the balance, and their starting wide receiver lay motionless on the sideline. His season ended by a cheap shot that should have drawn a flag. Derrick's mind raced back to 1985, to another October night, when he was 17 and unstoppable. When college scouts filled these same bleachers and his future stretched endlessly ahead. That was before the injury, before the cut, before 20 years of wondering what could have been. Now, as he jogged toward the huddle, his knees creaking like old floorboards, the town barber shouted from the stands, "Show him what Jefferson boys are made of, coach." Tonight wasn't just about winning a football game. It was about proving that dreams deferred aren't always dreams denied. That sometimes the most powerful victories come to those who were tanned. That in small-town America, where Friday night lights burn eternal, it's never too late to rewrite your story. The referee's whistle pierced the crisp autumn air, and Derrick Thomas, mechanic turned coach, turned unlikely hero, prepared to silence 20 years of doubt with one final drive. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Jefferson, Texas, population 3,847. Was the kind of place where everybody knew your business before you did. Nestled in the pine forests of East Texas, 30 miles from the Louisiana border. It was a town built on timber, oil, and the unwavering belief that high school football could save a boy's soul. The water tower bore the school's colors blue and silver along with the years of state championships. 1967, 1982, and the faded paint of dreams that hadn't come true since. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with brick storefronts that had weathered more booms and busts than anyone cared to count. Wilson's Hardware still sold the same hunting rifles and fishing tackle it had for 40 years. And Mabel's Diner still served chicken fried steak every Friday before the game. The Thomas family lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Cedar Street, where the American flag hung proudly from the front porch, and the lawn stayed green through sheer determination and frequent watering. Derrick's father, Ray, worked double shifts at the lumber mill. His calloused hands, proof of 30 years spent turning East Texas pine into the bones of houses across the South. His mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary, where she'd earned the reputation as both the sweetest and the strictest teacher in the county. They'd raised their boy on the values that built small-town America: hard work, respect for elders, and the understanding that your word was your bond. When Derrick was 12, Ray had built him a tire swing in the backyard, and the boy had spent countless hours running patterns around it, catching passes from his father until the mosquitoes drove them inside. Football wasn't just a sport in Jefferson, it was religion, and Friday nights were worship. The entire town shut down when the Eagles took the field, businesses closing early so everyone could make the pilgrimage to Memorial Stadium. Derrick had grown up in the shadow of legends, hearing stories of the great teams that had put Jefferson on the map. Coach Bobby Hutchins, a gruff man with a heart of gold and a voice that could be heard 3 counties over, had built a program that turned farm boys into scholars and troubled kids into leaders. He preached that football was life in miniature. You got knocked down, you got back up, and you never quit on your teammates. The weight room beneath the stadium was a temple of iron and sweat, where boys became men and dreams took shape 1 rep at a time. At 17, Derrick Thomas was everything a small-town hero should be. 6'2" with the build of a natural athlete, he moved like poetry in motion, his roots so crisp they could cut glass. He'd been catching passes since he was old enough to hold a football. His hands so reliable that Coach Hutchins called him stone hands because nothing bounced off them. The local paper, the Jefferson Gazette, had been following his career since his sophomore year, when he'd caught the game-winning touchdown against rival Marshall High. By his senior year, college scouts were regular fixtures in the Memorial Stadium stands, clipboards in hand, and dreams of scholarships dancing in their heads. Louisiana State, Texas A&M, and even the University of Texas had sent letters, and Derrick's bedroom wall was papered with recruitment flyers. The injury happened on a Tuesday practice in October, 3 weeks before the state playoffs. It was a routine drill -11-on-11, working on red zone offense when linebacker Marcus Webb came in late and low. The hit was clean by the book, but devastating in its impact. Derrick's knee buckled like a house of cards, the ligaments tearing with a sound that echoed across the practice field like a gunshot. He writhed in the East Texas dirt, clutching his leg and screaming, not from pain, but from the sudden terrible understanding that his world had just ended. The orthopedic surgeon in Tyler delivered the verdict with clinical precision: torn ACL, damaged meniscus, and a recovery time that would stretch well beyond graduation. The scholarship offers evaporated like morning dew, and the boy who'd been destined for greatness found himself cut from the only team that had ever mattered. The final insult came 2 weeks later, when Coach Hutchins called Derrick into his office and delivered the news that would haunt him for the next 20 years. "Son," the old coach said, his voice heavy with regret, "we've got to free up your roster spot. The boys who are healthy need to know they're the priority now." It was a business decision, Hutchins explained, nothing personal. The team needed to move forward, and Derrick's presence would only serve as a reminder of what was lost. As he cleaned out his locker, the equipment manager, man who'd been with the program for 15 years, wouldn't even make eye contact. The boy who'd been the toast of Jefferson was suddenly invisible, his dreams discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Town that had once celebrated Derrick Thomas quickly forgot him. The local sports reporter stopped taking his calls. The college recruiters vanished like smoke, and even some of his teammates began treating him like a stranger. On Friday nights, he'd sit in his truck outside the stadium, listening to the cheers and watching the lights, feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. His parents tried to console him, talking about other opportunities and different paths. But Derrick knew the truth. In Jefferson, Texas, if you couldn't play football, you were nobody. The boy who'd once been destined for greatness had become just another cautionary tale. A reminder that in the cruel mathematics of sports, talent without opportunity equals nothing at all. ***, 20 years later, Derrick Thomas stood in the packing lot of Memorial Stadium, watching his past collide with his present like a freight train hitting a brick wall. His hands, now permanently stained with motor oil and scarred from 2 decades of working on engines, gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck as he debated whether to walk away, or finally face the ghosts that had been haunting him since 1985. The October air carried the familiar scent of cut grass and teenage dreams, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sharp blast of Coach Rodriguez's whistle calling the current Eagles to practice. The letter from Principal Margaret Watson lay crumpled on his passenger seat, her words still echoing in his mind. "We need volunteers who understand what it means to be an Eagle, Derrick. These boys could use someone who knows the weight of wearing that jersey." The years had been kind to Jefferson in some ways, cruel in others. The town had managed to survive the economic downturns that had gutted other East Texas communities, but the glory days of Eagles football seemed like ancient history. The program had struggled for the better part of a decade, producing mediocre seasons and boys who lacked the fire that had once made Jefferson a name to be feared across the state. Coach Rodriguez, a young man barely 5 years out of college, was trying his best, but he was fighting an uphill battle against apathy and the weight of expectations. The current seniors had never won a playoff game, and the underclassmen were already making plans for after graduation that didn't include football scholarships. The town's faith in their beloved Eagles was wavering, and Friday night crowds had dwindled to a faithful few hundred. Derrick's own journey had taken him far from the bright lights and college dreams of his youth. After graduation, he'd taken a job at Murphy's garage on the outskirts of town, learning to fix what was broken rather than dwelling on what couldn't be repaired. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, a girl who'd seen past his shattered dreams to the man he could become. They'd had 2 kids, Jessica, now 15 and more interested in theater than touchdowns, and Michael, 13 and blessed with his father's athletic genes but cursed with his mother's practical nature. The family lived in a modest house on Elm Street, where Derrick had built a workshop in the back where he restored classic cars and tried to forget that he'd once been the best wide receiver in East Texas history. The call had come on a Tuesday evening in September, just as Derrick was finishing up work on a 1967 Camaro. That had been his obsession for the better part of 2 years. Principal Watson's voice was warm but urgent, explaining that the Eagles needed volunteers for their coaching staff. The current assistants were overwhelmed, and the boys needed mentors who understood the tradition of Jefferson football. She'd heard that Derrick had been helping his son Michael with his roots in the backyard, and several people had mentioned that he still had the touch. "These kids need someone who knows what it's like to dream big," she'd said, and the words had hit Derrick like a physical blow. He'd promised to think about it, but in his heart, he knew he was already hooked. The first practice was a revelation, and a heartbreak rolled into one. The current Eagles were talented but unfocused, skilled but lacking the killer instinct that had made Jefferson legendary. They went through the motions with the enthusiasm of boys serving detention, and their execution was sloppy enough to make Coach Hutchins roll over in his grave. During position drills, Derrick watched the wide receivers run routes with all the precision of a drunken sailor. Their cuts soft, and their concentration scattered like leaves in a windstorm. When Coach Rodriguez asked him to demonstrate proper technique, Derrick felt 20 years of rust and regret melt away as he showed the boys how to plant and cut, how to use their bodies to create separation, how to catch with their hands instead of their hearts. For 45 minutes, he was 17 again, and the magic was still there. The breakthrough came during a scrimmage in the 3rd week of October, when starting receiver Danny Martinez went down with a sprained ankle and the offense stalled like a broken-down pickup truck. The younger receivers weren't ready for the pressure, and Coach Rodriguez was running out of options with the district championship on the line. As the frustration mounted and the boys began to lose faith in themselves, Derrick made a decision that would change everything. He walked onto the field, gathered the receivers around him, and began teaching them the secrets that had made him special: how to read a safety's eyes, how to adjust routes on the fly, how to catch passes in traffic when the lights were brightest and the stakes were highest. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd been there, who'd felt the weight of a town's expectations and carried them with grace. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. The receivers began running routes with newfound precision, their confidence growing with each successful rep. Senior captain Tommy Morrison, a good kid from a broken home who'd been playing on pure heart and minimal technique, suddenly looked like a legitimate college prospect. The underclassmen stopped treating practice like a chore and began approaching it like an opportunity. Even the veterans who'd been going through the motions started playing with renewed fire, inspired by the presence of someone who understood what it meant to bleed blue and silver. As the sun set over Memorial Stadium and the boys walked off the field with their heads held high, Derrick Thomas realized that he'd found something he'd thought was lost forever: the chance to make a difference, to be part of something greater than himself, to prove that sometimes the most important victories are the ones you help others achieve. The first real test came in the form of district rival Marshall High, a school that had been Jefferson's nemesis for 3 decades and counting. The Mavericks had dominated the series in recent years, their superior size and speed making them prohibitive favorites every time the two teams met. As Derrick stood on the sideline during warm-ups, he could see the difference in the teams. Demeanor. Marshall's players moved with the swagger of conquerors, while his Eagles looked like they were heading to their own execution. The crowd was smaller than usual, a reflection of the town's diminished expectations, and the few college scouts in attendance were clearly there to watch Marshall's star linebacker, not Jefferson's struggling offense. The autumn air was crisp, enough to see your breath, and Derrick's hands shook slightly as he gripped his clipboard, knowing that tonight would determine whether his return to football was a fairy tale or a fool's errand. The game was a disaster from the opening kickoff. Marshall's offense moved the ball at will, their running game grinding out yards like a machine while their quarterback picked apart Jefferson's secondary with surgical precision. By the end of the first quarter, the Eagles were down 14-0, and the home crowd was already heading for the exits. Derrick watched from the sideline as his receivers struggled to get open, their routes lacking the sharpness they'd shown in practice. The offensive line, a group of undersized but determined kids, was getting manhandled by Marshall's bigger, stronger front seven. Even Tommy Morrison, who'd been playing with newfound confidence, looked overwhelmed by the pressure and the lights. The scoreboard told the story, 28-7 at halftime. With Jefferson lucky to have scored it all, the locker room was a tomb of shattered dreams and broken spirits. Coach Rodriguez tried to rally the troops with a speech about pride and perseverance, but Derrick could see it in the boys' eyes. They'd already given up. These were kids who'd been told their entire lives that they weren't good enough, that Jefferson's glory days were ancient history, that they were just marking time until graduation. The seniors sat with their heads in their hands, knowing that their last chance at postseason glory was slipping away like sand through their fingers. The underclassmen stared at their cleats, already mentally preparing for the long bus ride home and the whispered conversations about how the program had lost its way. It was then that Derrick Thomas made the decision that would define not just the rest of the season, but the rest of his life. "Y'all want to know what it feels like to be an Eagle?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The boys looked up, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "It ain't about the scoreboard, and it ain't about what people expect. It's about looking the man across from you in the eye and telling him he's going to have to kill you to stop you. It's about knowing that when you put on that jersey, you're carrying the dreams of every man who wore it before you." He told them about the 1982 team that had won the state championship, about boys who'd been counted out and forgotten but had refused to quit. He spoke of Coach Hutchins's favorite saying, "Champions aren't made in the fourth quarter, they're revealed." By the time he finished, the room was electric with possibility, and the boys were leaning forward like they were hanging on every word. The second half was a different game entirely. Jefferson's offense, led by a rejuvenated Tommy Morrison, began moving the ball with purpose and precision. The receivers ran their routes with the intensity of men possessed, creating separation and making catches in traffic that would have been impossible just weeks before. The defense, inspired by the offensive surge, began playing with an attitude that had been missing for years. They forced 3 turnovers in the third quarter, each one bringing the crowd to its feet and the Eagles closer to the impossible. With 5 minutes left in the game, Jefferson had closed the gap to 28-21, and Memorial Stadium was rocking like it hadn't in a decade. The comeback fell short. Marshall managed to run out the clock, but something had changed in the hearts and minds of the Eagles. They'd tasted what it felt like to believe in themselves, and they liked it. The aftermath of the Marshall game was a turning point for the entire program. The boys who'd been going through the motions were now the first ones to practice and the last ones to leave. Tommy Morrison, who'd been academically ineligible for the first half of the season, suddenly found the motivation to bring his grades up and began talking about college for the first time in his life. The younger players started asking Derrick to stay after practice for extra work, hungry to learn everything he could teach them about the game he'd mastered 2 decades earlier. Even the parents began showing up to practices, drawn by the buzz around town that something special was happening at Jefferson. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the Eagles' transformation, and suddenly people were talking about football again in the barbershops and diners along Main Street. But success brought its own challenges. The pressure to live up to the renewed expectations weighed heavily on Derrick's shoulders, and he found himself lying awake at night, wondering if he was in over his head. His marriage to Sarah was strained by the time he was spending at the school, and his own kids were feeling neglected as he poured his energy into other people's children. The old injury in his knee was acting up from all the running and demonstrating, and there were mornings when he could barely get out of bed. The ghosts of his past were never far away, whispering doubts about whether he was really making a difference, or just reliving his glory days through these boys. The weight of the town's expectations, the pressure to succeed, and the fear of letting down another generation of Jefferson Eagles threatened to crush him like a bug under a boot. But every time he thought about quitting, he'd see the light in Tommy Morrison's eyes or hear the crack of a perfect pass hitting a receiver's hands. And he'd remember why he'd come back to this place where dreams were born and heroes were made. The moment of truth arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in November, when Derrick stood alone in the Jefferson High weight room, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the possibilities of his future. The Eagles had just qualified for the playoffs for the first time in 7 years, and the entire town was buzzing with excitement that bordered on hysteria. But Derrick felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was destined to let everyone down just like he had before. The ancient fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls, decorated with faded photographs of championship teams and forgotten heroes. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who'd aged beyond his years, his face lined with the kind of wear that comes from carrying other people's dreams. The revelation came not in a flash of lightning or a moment of divine inspiration, but in the quiet words of an unlikely prophet, Mrs. Henderson. The school custodian who'd been at Jefferson since before Derrick was born, found him sitting in the empty locker room after practice, staring at the number 18 jersey that hung in his old locker, the same jersey that had once represented everything he'd thought he wanted. "You know what I remember about you, Derrick Thomas?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "It wasn't how many touchdowns you caught or how many yards you ran. It was how you helped Jimmy Martinez learn to read when he was struggling in Mrs. Wilson's class, how you made sure the younger kids got rides home when their parents were working late. You've always been a teacher, son. Football was just the classroom." The words hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly everything made sense. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost: the scholarships, the glory, the chance to play on Saturday afternoons, that he'd missed what he'd gained. The ability to see potential in kids who'd been written off. The wisdom that comes from having your dreams shattered and finding the strength to build new ones. The understanding that true victory isn't measured in points on a scoreboard, but in the lives you touch and the people you help become better than they thought possible. He'd spent 20 years thinking he was a failure, when in reality he'd been preparing for the most important role of his life. Not as a player, but as a teacher, a mentor, a keeper of the flame that made small-town football sacred. The transformation in Derrick's approach was immediate and profound. Instead of trying to relive his glory days through his players, he began focusing on helping them write their own stories. He spent hours after practice working with kids who weren't even on the team, teaching them the fundamentals of the game and the bigger lessons about life that football could provide. He started a program for struggling students, using football metaphors to help them understand that education, like athletics, required discipline, practice, and the willingness to get back up after being knocked down. The weight room became a sanctuary where boys could talk about their fears and dreams, where academic struggles were addressed with the same intensity as athletic ones. The community response was overwhelming. Parents who'd been skeptical of the new volunteer coach began seeking his advice about their children's futures. Local businesses started sponsoring team equipment and offering part-time jobs to players who maintained their grades. The barbershop on Main Street, which had been a haven for old-timers complaining about the sorry state of Jefferson football, suddenly became a place where people gathered to talk about the miraculous turnaround and the man who'd made it possible. Even former players from the glory days began showing up to practices. drawn by the infectious enthusiasm that had returned to the program. The Eagles weren't just winning games, they were bringing a community together around shared values and common purpose. As the playoffs approached, Derrick found himself thinking less about his own redemption and more about the boys who'd become like sons to him. Tommy Morrison had raised his GPA enough to be eligible for a partial scholarship to a junior college, where he could continue playing while getting his education. The younger receivers were already being watched by scouts from small colleges, their fundamentals so sound that they stood out from the crowd of athletes who relied purely on talent. Even the linemen, who rarely got the glory but did the dirty work that made everything else possible, were walking taller and carrying themselves with the pride of men who knew their worth. The program had become about more than football. It was about teaching young men that they were capable of greatness. Regardless of their circumstances, the night before the first playoff game, Derrick stood on the 50-yard line of Memorial Stadium, looking up at the lights that had once seemed so bright and now felt like old friends welcoming him home. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of possibility and the promise of dreams yet to be fulfilled. He thought about the 17-year-old boy who'd once stood in this same spot, believing that football was everything and that, without it, life had no meaning. That boy had been wrong, but he'd also been right in ways he couldn't have understood at the time. Football wasn't everything, it was the vehicle that taught you what everything actually was. The real victory wasn't in the game he'd never gotten to play, but in the lives he'd been privileged to touch and the legacy he was building one practice, one player, one moment at a time. The text message from his wife, Sarah, brought him back to the present. The whole town's talking about you, but I've always known what you were capable of. These boys are lucky to have you, and so are we. Now come home and let me make you some dinner before you change the world tomorrow. He smiled, pocketing the phone and taking one last look around the stadium that had been his heaven and his hell, his beginning and his second chance. Tomorrow, the Jefferson Eagles would take the field with the weight of a community's dreams on their shoulders. But tonight, Derrick Thomas was finally at peace with the man he'd become and the path that had led him back to where he belonged. The state championship semifinal against the Longview Lobos was everything. Texas high school football was supposed to be a collision of dreams and determination under the bright lights of Cowboys Stadium in Arlington. 40,000 fans packed the massive venue, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Jefferson's section, though smaller than Longview's, was pure passion in blue and silver. With 3 generations of Eagles fans who'd made the 2-hour drive to witness what many believed was impossible. The November air was electric with anticipation, and Derrick could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. This was the game that would define not just the season, but the resurrection of a program and the redemption of a man who'd been carrying the burden of unfinished business for 21 years. The first half was a defensive struggle that tested every lesson the Eagles had learned about perseverance and mental toughness. Longview brought the kind of size and speed that had made them a powerhouse for decades. Their running game grinding out yards like a machine, while their defense made every Jefferson possession feel like climbing Mount Everest. The Lobos star quarterback, a kid named Jackson Turner who was already committed to LSU, picked apart the Eagles' secondary with surgical precision, finding receivers in the gaps of zone coverage and making throws that belonged on highlight reels. By halftime, Jefferson trailed 14-3, and the crowd was beginning to sense that this might be the end of the magical season. In the locker room, the boys sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the cruel reality that sometimes dreams aren't enough to overcome talent and preparation. The turning point came with 8 minutes left in the third quarter, when Tommy Morrison took a vicious hit while trying to make a catch over the middle. The impact was sickening, the kind of collision that makes grown men wince and mothers cover their eyes. Morrison lay motionless on the artificial turf for what felt like an eternity, medical staff rushing to his side while 40,000 people held their collective breath. When he was finally helped to his feet, it was clear that his night and, possibly his season, was over. The kid who'd been Derrick's greatest success story, who'd transformed from a directionless teenager into a legitimate college prospect, was watching his dreams slip away with each step toward the sideline. The Eagles' offensive coordinator turned to Derrick with panic in his eyes. "We don't have anyone else who can run those routes. What do we do now?" The decision came without hesitation, driven by 21 years of what-ifs and the desperate need to prove that some stories have endings worth waiting for. Derrick Thomas, 38 years old and carrying the scars of 2 decades away from the game, began stripping off his windbreaker to reveal the shoulder pads he'd been wearing underneath all night. The crowd's reaction was immediate and thunderous, 1,000 people rising to their feet in disbelief and admiration as the volunteer coach, who'd been cut at 17, prepared to take the field in the biggest game of his life. His teammates, boys young enough to be his sons, gathered around him in the huddle with respect and determination in their eyes. They'd seen him run routes in practice, had watched him demonstrate techniques with the precision of a master craftsman, but this was different. This was the moment when legends are born and impossible dreams become reality. The first play was a simple slant route, designed to get Derrick's hands on the ball and settle his nerves. But as he broke from the line and felt the familiar burn of acceleration in his legs, 21 years of rust melted away like morning frost. His route was crisp, his hands sure, and when the ball nestled into his palms, the crowd exploded with a sound that could have been heard in Dallas. The next play was a comeback route that required him to make a catch in traffic, and when he held onto the ball despite taking a hit that would have felled a younger man, the Jefferson sideline erupted in celebration. By the time they reached the red zone, Derrick had caught 4 passes for 57 yards, and the impossible was becoming inevitable. The touchdown came on a perfectly executed fade route to the back corner of the end zone, where Derrick's experience and instincts allowed him to position his body between the defender and the ball. As he crossed the goal line, he thought not of personal vindication, but of the boys who'd made this moment possible. The final drive was pure poetry in motion, a symphony of precision and will that captured everything beautiful about Texas high school football. With 2 minutes left, and Jefferson trailing by 3, the Eagles began their march from their own 20-yard line with the poise of a veteran team and the heart of true champions. Derrick caught passes over the middle, along the sideline, and in the flat, his routes so precise they seemed drawn with a ruler. The offensive line, a group of kids who'd been written off as too small and too slow, gave their aging receiver the protection he needed to work his magic. With 30 seconds left, Jefferson faced 4th and goal from the 80-yard line, and the entire stadium stood in anticipation of what would happen next. The call was simple. Trips, right, Ziat onto. Derrick lined up in the slot, his heart hammering against his ribs, and when the ball was snapped, he ran the route of his life. The catch was perfect in its simplicity, quick out route that found the soft spot in the zone coverage, executed with the precision of a man who'd been practicing it in his mind for 21 years. As the ball settled into his hands and he crossed the goal line, time seemed to stand still. The crowd erupted in pure joy. His teammates mobbed him with the enthusiasm of kids who'd just witnessed a miracle. And somewhere in the stands, his father Ray wiped tears from his eyes as he watched his son finally get the ending his story deserved. The final score was Jefferson 24, Longview 21. But the numbers on the scoreboard couldn't capture the magnitude of what had just happened. A man who'd been discarded at 17 had returned at 38 to lead his team to the state championship game, proving that in the grand theater of Texas high school football, some stories are too powerful to be contained by time or circumstance. As confetti fell from the ceiling, and the Eagles celebrated their first state championship appearance in 15 years, Derrick Thomas stood at midfield, surrounded by the boys who'd become his legacy and the community that had given him a second chance. The journey from that devastating cut in 1985 to this moment of triumph in 2006 had been long and sometimes painful, but it had led him exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought of Tommy Morrison, who despite his injury had been the first person to congratulate him after the winning touchdown. and of all the other boys who'd learned that setbacks aren't endings but opportunities to rewrite your story. In the end, this wasn't just about football, it was about the power of perseverance, the importance of community, and the truth that sometimes the most meaningful victories are the ones that take a lifetime to achieve. The immediate aftermath of the championship game was a blur of television interviews, newspaper reporters, and a community celebration that lasted well into the Texas night. Derrick found himself thrust into the spotlight he'd once craved. But now he viewed it through the lens of a man who understood that individual glory was meaningless without the context of shared achievement. The ESPN cameras captured him hoisting the state championship trophy alongside his players, but what they couldn't show was the quiet moment in the locker room when he'd gathered the boys together one final time. "This trophy belongs to all of you," he'd told them, his voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, it belongs to everyone who believed in second chances and refused to give up on dreams that seemed impossible." The celebration would be remembered for years to come, but the real victory was in the lives that had been changed and the lesson that had been learned. That redemption is never too late for those brave enough to chase it. The long-term impact of that magical season rippled through Jefferson, Texas, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Tommy Morrison, despite his injury, received a full scholarship to play at a Division II school, where he'd go on to earn his degree in education and return to coach high school football. 3 other players from that championship team would receive college scholarships, and more importantly, the entire senior class would graduate, a feat that hadn't been accomplished in over a decade. The program that Derrick had helped rebuild would win 2 more state championships in the following 5 years, establishing Jefferson as a powerhouse once again. But beyond the trophies and the accolades, the greatest achievement was the transformation of a community's belief in itself, and the understanding that greatness isn't measured solely by scoreboards, but by the courage to keep fighting when the odds seem insurmountable. The lessons learned from Derrick Thomas's journey transcended football and spoke to the fundamental values that make America great. His story became a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of community, and the truth that setbacks are often setups for comebacks. In high school gymnasiums and barbershops across East Texas, people would tell the story of the man who was cut at 17 but came back at 38 to lead his team to glory. It became a parable about the value of hard work, the importance of never giving up on your dreams, and the understanding that success isn't always about individual achievement but about lifting others up along the way. The story reminded everyone who heard it that in America, where second chances are part of the national DNA, it's never too late to rewrite your story and find redemption in the most unlikely places. Derrick Thomas was no longer the broken teenager who'd been cut from his high school team. Nor was he simply the mechanic who'd spent 20 years wondering what might have been. He'd become something more powerful, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the transformative power of sports, and a reminder that true champions are defined not by their victories but by their ability to inspire others to achieve greatness. The boy who'd once dreamed of playing college football had become a man who'd helped dozens of other boys achieve their own dreams. His jersey was retired at halftime of the following season's homecoming game, but the number 18 would never truly be retired, would live on in the hearts of everyone who'd learned that the most important victories are the ones that come after you've been knocked down and counted out. The ripple effects of that championship season continued to spread far beyond the borders of Jefferson, Texas. Derrick's story was featured in national magazines and became the subject of a documentary film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. But more importantly, it inspired other small towns across America to believe in the power of their own stories and the possibility of their own redemption. Youth football programs began reaching out to former players who'd been overlooked or forgotten, asking them to come back and share their knowledge with a new generation. The lesson was clear. Talent may fade and opportunities may pass, but the desire to make a difference and the wisdom that comes from experience are gifts that only grow more valuable with time. In the end, the story of Derrick Thomas wasn't just About one man's journey from heartbreak to triumph. It was about the enduring power of the American dream and the communities that nurture it. It was about the understanding that in small towns across this great nation, where Friday night lights illuminate more than just football fields, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender to circumstance. His legacy lived on, not just in championship banners or record books, but in the countless young men who learned that being knocked down isn't falling, it's just getting into position to rise again. The final image that would forever define Derrick Thomas's story wasn't the touchdown catch that won the championship, spectacular as it was. Instead, it was the sight of him on the Monday morning after the victory, back in his mechanic's coveralls at Murphy's garage, working on a transmission while wearing his state championship ring. When a reporter asked him how it felt to be a local legend, he'd smiled and said, "Son, I'm just a man who got a second chance to do what he was always meant to do, help young people believe in themselves." That was the essence of his transformation. He'd learned that being a hero isn't about personal glory or individual achievement, but about using whatever gifts you have to make the world a little bit better for the people around you. In Jefferson, Texas, where dreams are born under Friday night lights and legends are made one play at a time, Derrick Thomas had finally found his place in the story, not as the star, but as the man who helped others shine brighter than they ever thought possible.